These are strange and troubled times, and we find ourselves in unexpected places of isolation within our own homes. We are exiles from our own lives, and yet we haven't gone anywhere. Around 2,600 years ago, a novice priest called Ezekiel was taken into exile by the Assyrians, taken to Babylon, taken from his home and forced to live in a camp on the banks of the river Kibar. The Kibar was an irrigation canal dug between the Tigris and the Euphrates. It was a place where people taken from their homes and nations would farm the land to grow crops for the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Ezekiel had been set to become a priest of the temple before his exile. During the preceding decades, there had been a huge move to centralize worship to the temple in Jerusalem. The temple built on the hill they called Mount Zion, the place where they believed God resided. And so when the Jewish people were taken from their homes, taken from their culture, taken from their central place of worship, there was also a feeling that they were being taken from their God. Psalm 137 cries out to us from that place of exile, saying, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked us for mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? How can we sing songs of the Lord when we cannot go to the temple, the place where our God lives? And today, how can we worship God when we cannot go to church?" In the midst of that exile, there was Ezekiel, disjointed and disconnected from his life plan, taken away not just from his home, but also from his God. And just as he was about to begin his life's work as an ordained priest. So what was his purpose now as a priest to a God whom he could not reach? A priest taken from the temple where his God lived. How could he sing the Lord's song in that strange land? And yet this is the time when Ezekiel began to flourish. He began to have visions and find ways of speaking to his people, to God's people, through words and through dramatic presentations, with messages of both comfort and challenge, words of both warning and hope. He spoke of a time when God would gather his people from the nations, gather the scattered people from the hills. Ezekiel began his story with a longing for the earthly temple, but he ended it with a perfect heavenly temple. He sets out as a priest without a sense of place in the world, longing for an earthly home, longing for the written scrolls of the temple. And along his journey he becomes a prophet who has a vision of eating the scrolls that taste like honey, a prophet who speaks of a day when God's law would be written on all of our hearts. He moves step by step from a faith bound up in a single physical place to a faith that can go anywhere and face up to all of life's trials. Perhaps his most well-known vision is that of the Valley of Dry Bones, where God calls upon him to speak to the bones and tell them to come together, to tell the flesh to grow upon the bones, and to tell the breath, the Spirit of God that hovered over the waters at creation, to tell that Spirit to enter into these lifeless bodies that they might live again. And God says, "These bones are the whole house of Israel." They say, "Our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. We are cut off." Does anybody feel like that today? "Oh, my people," says the Lord, "I will bring you back to the land of Israel." Of course, at this point, Ezekiel is still envisaging that earthly Israel, the earthly Jerusalem. But the promise was there that God would breathe new life into these broken people who needed hope, and who needed to know that their God was still with them, even in this place of exile. There was a story in John chapter 4 where a woman at a well says to Jesus, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." And Jesus replies to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The gospel reading for this Sunday is from John chapter 11. And in it we hear of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Now there will be many times, no doubt, when we need to ponder the mysteries of resurrection and the physical raising of the dead. There were then, as there no doubt will be today, those who long for loved ones who have died in such times of crisis. People struggling to know how to mourn in exile, just as Ezekiel struggled to mourn the loss of his wife. There will be, I hope, a day when in many ways we will all be unbound and set free as Lazarus was. But for today, I think our greatest need is to be able to focus on that promise that we can be raised from spiritual, psychological and emotional death, that we can be lifted up out of our places of isolation and despair into a place where we know that God is with us. We need to know that even in our darkest places of exile, God is there to breathe new life into us so that we may truly live again in this world as much as the next. And just as God called on Ezekiel to be a conduit to that breath of life, to be the person speaking on God's behalf to the exiled people of Israel, so we too need to be the conduits of that breath to each other. We need to breathe the hope of new life into each other in the way that we treat each other in these difficult times. Ezekiel longed to go home, but he had to learn how to be the conduit of God's message of hope and love in the place where he was. Many of us cannot go out and are stuck in our homes. None of us should be going to our places of worship at this time. But we can learn how to be the conduits of God's message and hope and love in the places where we are. I hope that you can find that hope in your place and recognize that God's love is with you. And even though we are distant from each other physically, know that we are together as God's people in this world. Amen.